Everyone. So today we're talking about Frantz Fanon. Uh, Sorry, I got my AC going in the background of this one. Hopefully that's not too distracting. Um, cool. So Fanon is a French Martinician philosopher. The sections that we're going to be reading this week and also part of next week have a lot to do. Well, they come from the book Black Skin, White Masks. This week we're looking at some stuff from chapter 5, which is called The Fact of Blackness. It could also be translated as the lived experience of the black man. It seems like a big difference, right? But oh, good, the AC went off. But you'll see maybe why those translations could possibly be equivocated, right? It was written in French, by the way, in case that wasn't obvious. So Fanon was born in French Martinique. That is to say, in 1925, he was born into a French colony, right? An area of the Caribbean that was under French control. The Nazi, there were a lot of Nazi U-boats in the Caribbean at the time, and when France was invaded in 1940, the Nazi Navy put a blockade around Martinique to sort of prevent people from getting out, to prevent activity from the naval base, the French naval base that was there, try to sort of choke out resources to the island. So that is to say, even the sort of provincial French government was put under military rule by naval forces in Martinique. And while this was happening, Fanon managed to escape the island when he was just a teenager, right? And he escaped the island, made it past the blockade, and fought with the Free French forces. Try to say that 3 times fast. But he joined the resistance, right? He fought against the Nazis in the African front, and he was actually part of a regiment that made it all the way to Casablanca and actually liberated that area from Nazi control in the sort of northern African front of World War II. So during this time, once it became clear that the Axis forces were kind of on the run, Fanon and most of the other people of color who were part of the military were kicked out, right? So he didn't get veterans benefits. They just sort of said, thanks for your help. During that time, he briefly returned to Martinique. Actually, one of his high school teachers was a guy named Ami Césaire. I'm not saying that very well at all, but they were friends, and Césaire was running a political campaign at the time, and he came back to help with that. Later on, he returned to France, lived in Paris, and while he was there, he studied psychiatry and philosophy and got doctoral degrees in both. I noted here that he also attended many of Merleau-Ponty's lectures, which would have resonated with you if this had been a different semester and we had read Merleau-Ponty, but that one got the axe due to circumstances. That's how it goes. But boy, would that have been a nice connection. I mean, he was also very close with Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, right? They were very often in dialogue with each other, right? And the book that we're reading, Black Skin, White Masks, is based on Fanon's doctoral philosophy dissertation, right? The name of the dissertation itself was Essay on the Disalienation of the Black, right? And you should remember that word alienation, right? That comes up. That came up when we were reading Marx, and Fanon is using alienation in a similar sense here. Beyond this, he was also a poet and a playwright. He was a polymath. He did everything. He spent some time working in a psychiatric hospital in Algeria, when Algeria was a French colony. Algeria claimed independence from France in the 20th century, sort of not long thereafter, because part of Fanon's job was being a sort of giving psychiatric treatment to French soldiers who were sort of dealing with the trauma of torturing anti-colonial dissidents, right? Which is just bananas, right? It must have been really hard for them to be torturers, right? Right, but they were trying to suppress any kind of independence movement in Algeria. Of course, Fanon later joined the Algerian National Liberation Front and fought for political independence. Fought on behalf of Algeria against French colonial power. So, just pause for a moment here, right? This guy is not only a philosopher, he is, he both fought with France against Nazis and then fought against France for anti-colonial liberation. Look, we're not going to read anybody cooler than this in this class. In fact, he was one of the people who was being considered for a democratic run for president of Algeria once it had been liberated. But he later got sick. He got sick quite young, actually. He didn't live much past his 40s. In his later life, he wrote quite a lot about guerrilla warfare, both the tactics and ethics of guerrilla warfare, especially insofar as it has to do with fighting against colonial power, right? The last work that he wrote was called The Wretched of the Earth, and that was written basically from his deathbed, right? That was written while Fanon was in the Soviet Union seeking treatment for his leukemia, since the Soviet Union at the time had some of the most advanced medicine. And The Wretched of the Earth was mostly dictated from his deathbed. In it, he sort of famously defends the use of violence against colonial regimes. But this is long before that. Like we said before, the work that we're reading here is Black Skin, White Masks, where the main theme of this work deals with, as he puts it, the internalized inferiority complex that is necessarily produced by colonialism, right? And so we have to answer the question here, right, what is colonialism? And on some level, that's quite easy, that's an easy question to answer, on a certain objective level. What it is, it describes a period of history in which, Europeans got on boats and went to different parts of the world and decided that they were in charge of their stuff, right? It's hard to put it any more bluntly than that, right? These people that we call explorers, right? They explored their way around the world and showed up places and told everyone that they were in charge now, and they were taking all their stuff. Here you can see. Here's a graphic of all the nations that have declared independence at some point from being colonized by the British Empire. Numerically, it's 66 different nations at one point or another declared independence from the British Empire. Here you see the nations that declared independence just in the 20th century, right? So that is to say, a lot of these independence movements were fairly recent. And it was actually sort of the end of World War II that marks the waning of the colonial era as such. I mean, it still persists in many ways, and in much different forms than it did before then, right? But, you know, the end of colonialism was fairly recent, in fact, and there are still many vestiges of it. Right. So that's sort of, I mean, it's easy to sort of explain what it is materially or objectively, or what it means in terms of, you know, the sovereignty and independence of nations, and whether or not they're being controlled by some sort of master European nation. I mean, you know, British Empire wasn't the only nation that engaged in colonialism. I mean, you know, the French did it, the Danish did it, Germans did it. I mean, like, every major European nation engaged in some form of colonialism, and the United States also engaged in colonialism, right? And we still have many colonies. But Fanon is sort of looking at the way that colonialism operates on a deeper level, right? And especially the way it operates on a phenomenological level. In the introduction to this book, which we didn't actually read the introduction, but I just want to touch on this point that he makes. He makes this sort of paradoxical statement when he says, the black man is not a man. And then at the end of the paragraph he says, the future of the black man is the white man. This is kind of a paradox here, right? I mean, or seemingly. I mean, on the one hand he says the black man is not a man, and then in the very next sentence he refers to the black man as a man, right? So what does he mean here? I mean, what he's trying to describe really is the way that, you know, colonialism is more than just showing up on the shore of somebody else's nation and taking their stuff. It necessarily involves an element of dehumanization, right? It removes the humanity from the colonized. Right, that's the only way that colonialism can be justified, right? And like many Europeans thought that colonialism was justified, and that it was ethically justified. And part of their reason and part of their thinking for this is they were under the impression, like, look, these other people, well, they aren't really people, or not yet, right? Or maybe they could be, right? The reason that in many cases colonial rule was justified is because, you know, white European descended people decided, like, well, you guys can't actually run your own society. Here, let us do it for you. Right? We can, like, there was paternalism built into it, right? And some Europeans actually thought that they were helping, right? They thought that they were helping by sort of being like, oh, no, you guys are confused. Here's how you do civilization, right? Here, like, you have to do it like us. Because if it's not like us, then it's not really civilization, right? It was the operant understanding that they brought to bear on these other nations, right? So it establishes a condition in which the colonized peoples are a lesser form of human, than the colonizer, right? But not only that, it also sets up a future for the colonized, right? It establishes, or it both takes away the humanity of the colonized, and at the same time establishes a rubric for how the colonized can achieve their humanity someday, hopefully, right? Where the model, right, the rubric that the colonized has to follow in order to become a human again is to become like the European man, right? Which is also, on some level, it's impossible for the colonized to become the European man. So it sort of sets up a situation, right, where in one fell swoop, both of these things are happening, right? The black man is not a man in the sense that colonialism subtracts a level of ethical humanity from the colonized, and also sets up the impossible benchmark for regaining the humanity which colonialism has taken away. But the way to regain it is only through the model of the colonizer, right? So that's what he means when he sets up these sort of seemingly contradictory statements. The black man is not a man, and the future of the black man is the white man, right? I mean, one way to put it is that colonialism creates a condition of kind of erasing and replacing culture, right? Colonialism relies on taking away whatever traditions or practices, religions and forms of life were happening already, and replacing them with European norms and European economic practices, European religions, and largely European forms of life, right? I mean, look, this happened in the United States too, especially with the indigenous people in the United States. I mean, if you've never heard about the Indian schools that were happening up until the mid 20th century, the Indian schools were considered by many people to be a much more ethical way of doing this, of successfully turning this former colony of the British Empire, the United States, into, well, let me put it this way. I mean, people thought, look, the compassionate thing to do is not to kill all these Native Americans who are living here. The saying was, you have to sort of kill the savage and how do they put it? Kill the savage and save the man, right? Which expresses exactly this idea that Fanon is getting at. This idea that look, these non-European peoples are not actually people, right? But rather than just get rid of them, there's a way that we can, the compassionate response, right? The compassionate in air quotes, is we have to re-educate these people so that they stop being subhuman, right? So in that way, with this like re-education and this sort of erasing of the culture that they have, we can replace it with European stuff. Like, we can turn them into the European man. And thus the whole thinking behind these Indian re-education schools, where kids were basically kidnapped and not allowed to speak in their mother tongues, that was a supposedly compassionate response by colonialism, right? Where they were saying, we still kill the savage, but we save the man, right? Insofar as we make you into the European man, right? So the main themes in this book have to do with this notion of recognition and the contrast between being for oneself and being for others, right? And that's going to lead us to talk about this concept of the gaze. It also deals with the meaning of the other, especially the meaning of the other where, the other already features prominently in Beauvoir and Arendt. And Fanon's going to be talking about this sort of self-other distinction through the lens of colonialism. And through that, he's going to be developing this notion of overdetermination. So I'm sorry to throw all these phrases at you at once. I mean, we're going to talk about those more on Thursday. But his main point, and the whole point of Black Skin, White Masks, is he's saying that to be black is to be a colonized subject, right? That is to say, to be black is always to be black in relation to white people, right? And this is the historical situation that was set up. This is the historical situation that we are thrown into on the basis of our history of colonialism, right? And the idea that the white gaze creates a kind of double consciousness, right? And therefore to live as a colonial subject, right? Or the kind of person for whom colonialism is just artifacted in the present that we find ourselves existing within, is to have internalized the kind of double consciousness that emerges through this relation. Okay, that's kind of a mouthful, right? These claims here, if they don't yet make sense, that's okay, because that's what we're going to be working through in the next lecture. Here I just want to set up the sort of baseline features that are required before we can get into talking about that. So we'll talk about that next time.